Barbra Streisand started reading the letter. At the third line, her voice stopped. She held her breath. And Jimmy Fallon froze because that letter revealed a secret that had been lost for 40 years. The Tonight Show. Monday night. February 2024. Jimmy Fallon sat behind his desk in his signature suit, grinning at one of the biggest legends in entertainment history. Barbra Streisand. Icon. EGOT winner. A woman who had defined multiple generations of music, film, and performance. The interview had been going perfectly. They talked about her latest project, laughed about old stories from her early days in New York, shared a funny moment about her famous perfectionism. The audience was loving it. Questlove and the Roots provided gentle musical punctuation. Everything was exactly what a Monday night Tonight Show interview should be. And then a production assistant walked onto the stage. It wasn't planned. PAs don't walk onto the stage during live interviews. Ever. The audience noticed immediately, heads turning, whispers starting. Jimmy looked confused, his smile faltering slightly. Barbra turned in her chair, curious. The young woman, her name tagged red, Sarah, approached Jimmy's desk nervously, carrying a small manila envelope. She leaned down and whispered something in Jimmy's ear that the microphones didn't catch. Jimmy's eyebrows rose. He looked at Barbra, then back at Sarah, then at the envelope. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. Sarah nodded, placed the envelope on his desk, and quickly exited the stage. The audience was completely silent now, the easy rhythm of the interview suddenly replaced by uncertainty. Jimmy picked up the envelope slowly. His hands were shaking slightly, something the cameras caught in close-up. "Barbra," he said, his usual playful tone gone, replaced by something careful and serious. "Something just happened that I don't know if we should do this on camera or—" "What is it?" Barbra asked, her legendary voice carrying that mixture of curiosity and command that had defined her career. Jimmy opened the envelope and pulled out a letter. Old. The paper was yellowed with age, the handwriting in faded blue ink. He scanned it quickly, his eyes widening with each line. "This is—" Jimmy stopped, looked at the audience, then back at Barbra. "This is from someone named Ruth Streisand." "Is that—" Barbra's entire body went rigid. "My mother," she whispered. "But that's impossible. She died in 2002. Jimmy stopped mid-sentence. The entire studio froze. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1984. Barbra Streisand was already a superstar. Multiple Grammy Awards. Oscar winner. Box office queen. She was at the absolute peak of her powers, commanding any project she wanted, respected and admired globally. But there was one person whose respect she never quite felt she had, her mother, Ruth. Ruth Streisand was a complicated woman. She'd been a school secretary in Brooklyn, raising Barbra and her siblings after her husband died when Barbra was just 15 months old. She was practical, skeptical of show business, protective of her daughter but also, by Barbra's own later admission, emotionally distant in ways that left scars. Barbra had spent her whole career trying to prove something. To audiences, yes. To critics, certainly. But mostly to her mother. To show that the strange, unconventional girl from Brooklyn with the big nose and bigger voice had been right to chase this impossible dream. Ruth was proud of Barbra. She'd say it sometimes, in her own way. But there was always a distance. A formality. They loved each other, but they never quite bridged the gap between Ruth's practical, Depression-era sensibilities and Barbra's artistic, emotional intensity. In December 1984, Barbra was preparing for a major concert tour. She'd invited her mother to opening night in her penthouse apartment, wanting to share the plans, wanting that approval she'd always chased. They'd sat in Barbra's living room, Barbra with her notes and costume sketches spread out, Ruth with her handbag on her lap like she was just visiting and might leave any moment. "It's going to be incredible, Mom," Barbra said, her voice carrying that enthusiasm that only came when she talked about her work. 27 cities. I've been working on the set list for months. Ruth nodded. That's nice, darling. I want you to come. To the opening. Front row. I'll make sure everything is perfect. We'll see, Ruth said in that non-committal way that meant probably not. Barbra felt the familiar ache. The same one she'd felt at every school play her mother had missed, every early nightclub performance Ruth had deemed too late to attend, every achievement that was met with, "That's nice, darling," instead of the enthusiasm Barbra craved. Why? Barbra asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. Why can't you just be excited for me? Just once, can you tell me you're proud without the distance? Ruth had stood up then, smoothing her skirt, picking up her handbag. You don't need my approval, Barbra. You have the whole world's approval. What difference does one old woman make? You're not just one old woman. You're my mother. Ruth had looked at her daughter, this global superstar sitting surrounded by the evidence of impossible success, and something had softened in her face. Just for a moment. I'll write you a letter, Ruth said quietly. I'm better with letters. I'll tell you everything I can't seem to say out loud. But not now. When the time is right. When will that be? You'll know, Ruth said and left. Barbra waited for that letter. For weeks. Then months. Then years. She never asked her mother about it. Some combination of pride and fear kept her from bringing it up. And Ruth never mentioned it again. In 2002, Ruth Streisand died at age 93. Barbra had been with her at the end, holding her mother's hand, finally getting some of the words she'd always wanted but still wondering about that promised letter. She'd gone through her mother's belongings afterward, looking for it, hoping. But there was nothing. No letter. No explanation. Barbra had assumed her mother had either never written it or had destroyed it, deciding some things were better left unsaid. For 22 years, Barbra Streisand had carried that absence. That wondering. That last unfulfilled promise from a complicated relationship. Until tonight. When a production assistant walked onto the Tonight Show stage with a manila envelope. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Jimmy was still holding the letter, staring at it like it might disappear if he looked away. Barbra had risen from the guest chair and moved closer to his desk, her hand extended. May I? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jimmy handed it over carefully, as if it were made of glass. Barbra took the letter in both hands. The audience was so silent you could hear the paper rustling. Every camera in the studio was locked on her face. She began reading aloud, her voice steady at first. My dearest Barbra, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I asked my dear friend Margaret to keep this letter safe and deliver it when the time felt right. I couldn't give it to you while I was alive. I tried so many times, but the words never came out right when I looked at you. Barbra's voice wavered. She paused, took a breath, continued. You asked me once why I couldn't show excitement for your success. Why I seemed distant when you needed me close. I need you to understand, it wasn't because I wasn't proud. It was because I was terrified. The word hung in the air. Barbra stopped reading, her hands beginning to tremble. Behind the scenes, Jimmy made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. In the control room, the director was talking rapidly into his headset. Do we cut? Do we go to commercial? This is getting heavy. But Jimmy had already made his choice. He stood up from behind his desk and walked around to where Barbra stood. He gently took her elbow, guided her back to the guest chair, and pulled up a stool so he could sit beside her. Take your time, he said softly, his hand resting on her shoulder. We're not going anywhere. Barbra looked at him, tears beginning to form in her eyes. I don't know if I can. You don't have to do this alone, Jimmy said. I'm right here. The whole room is with you. Read as much or as little as you want. Barbra nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She looked down at the letter again, her mother's handwriting swimming in her vision. She took a deep breath, and held it. That's when Jimmy froze. That's when the studio went completely still. Because everyone understood what was happening. Barbra Streisand was about to read the words she'd waited 40 years to hear. She exhaled slowly and continued, her voice breaking. I was terrified that if I showed you how proud I was, how amazed I was by everything you accomplished, you would realize you didn't need me anymore. That you'd outgrown your mother from Brooklyn. I kept my distance because distance felt safer than risking your rejection. A sound escaped Barbra's throat, half sob, half gasp. The letter shook in her hands. But the truth, my darling girl, is that I have been proud of you since the day you were born. Not because you became famous. Not because you won awards or sold millions of records. I was proud because you were brave enough to be yourself in a world that told you to be smaller, quieter, more conventional. Barbra stopped reading. Her breath caught. She held it, literally held it, her chest not moving, her mouth open but no sound coming out. Jimmy's hand tightened on her shoulder. Barbra? He said quietly. She couldn't respond. The letter trembled violently in her grasp. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming. Jimmy gently took the letter from Barbra's shaking hands. She let him, her arms falling to her lap, her breathing still suspended like she'd forgotten how. Can I read the rest? Jimmy asked softly. Barbra nodded, unable to speak. Jimmy stood, holding the letter carefully. He looked at the audience, at the cameras, at Questlove who had tears streaming down his face. Then he read. Every time you stepped onto a stage I held my breath. Every time you took a risk with your career I held my breath. Not because I doubted you, because I knew you would succeed, and I was afraid of how much space that success would put between us. Jimmy's own voice was breaking now. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you while I was alive. I'm sorry I let my fear create distance when you needed closeness. But I need you to know, every award you won, I celebrated in private. Every performance you gave, I cried in the back row where you couldn't see me. Every brave choice you made, I whispered that's my daughter to anyone who would listen. The studio audience was crying openly. Some had their faces in their hands. Others clutched the people beside them. Jimmy continued. You asked when the time would be right for this letter. The right time is when you need to hear it most. When you're doubting yourself. When success feels empty. When you wonder if any of it mattered. That's when I want you to read this and remember, you were always enough. You are my greatest pride. You are my brave, brilliant, impossible girl, and I loved you more than I knew how to show. With all my heart, Mom. Jimmy finished reading and looked at Barbra, who sat motionless in the guest chair, tears streaming down her face, her hand pressed to her chest. Then Jimmy did something that would be talked about for years. He carefully folded the letter, walked to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a simple wooden box. He placed the letter inside, closed the lid, and brought it back to Barbra. This is my memory box, Jimmy said, his voice thick with emotion. I keep things here that matter. Things that remind me why I do this show. I want you to have it. To keep your mother's letter safe. Barbra took the box with shaking hands. She opened it, looked at the letter inside, and then did something no one expected. She laughed. A small, broken, beautiful laugh. She was always terrible at timing. Barbra said through tears. 40 years late. That's so her. Jimmy laughed too, wiping his eyes. The audience erupted. Not in applause yet, but in that collective release of held breath, that sound of 300 people crying and laughing at the same time. Barbra stood, clutching the box to her chest. Thank you, she whispered to Jimmy. For letting me read it. For not cutting away. For holding space for this. Jimmy pulled her into a hug. The cameras caught it all. Two people standing on a late-night talk show stage, holding each other while the world watched grief and healing happen in real time. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. The production assistant who delivered the envelope was Margaret's granddaughter. Ruth's friend had kept the letter for 22 years, waiting for the right moment. She'd watched Barbra's career, waiting for a sign. When she saw Barbra scheduled for The Tonight Show, a platform of joy and connection, she knew. The wooden box sits on Barbra's piano now. She opens it before every performance. Her mother finally got to say the words. And Barbra finally got to breathe.